American South has always been a mysterious generator of literary fire and beauty and pathos for reasons that have been endlessly explored, for reasons as simple as that men are endlessly curious about any cradle of genius. The new tranquility of the South could conceivably put an end to it. One possibility. Another is that it will bring on a spiritual peace that will permit a more untroubled pursuit of culture and art. But the question will be asked, what exactly is the Southern imagination? What does it come from and why? Does it have anything distinctive to say? What are its particular attributes? There is no way that you can say about Eudora, Welty, or Walker Percy that they are Southern writers in the sense that their work is done for the benefit of a regional audience. Eudora Welty is as interesting to New Yorkers as Mary McCarthy is to Alabamians. Still, she is a Southerner, born and educated here in Jackson, Mississippi, and at the University of Wisconsin, a brief excursion out of state, then back to begin writing those numinous short stories and novels that have brought pleasure to a generation of readers and distinction to her profession. Her current novel is called The Optimist's Daughter. Other landmarks in her career include Delta Wedding, The Ponder Heart, and Lost Battles. Walker Percy went out of Mississippi to go to college, all the way up to what Senator Claghorn once insisted should be called Upper South Carolina. After Chapel Hill, he went to Columbia and became a medical doctor. That was during the war, but before he had a chance to practice, he contracted tuberculosis, which turned out to be a good excuse to do more reading. Years went by, and suddenly there was a novel, The Movie Door. It won the National Book Award in 1967. Then The Last Gentleman, and a year ago, the funniest, the shrewdest, the most poignant and jubilant novel of the decade, Love in the Ruins. I should like to begin by asking Miss Welty, what is it you think you can see better for living in the South than you could living outside it?
Well, as a writer, I think I see in the South what's the essential, because I take what I know as for granted. So I see the new as the new and the old as the old, and I feel I'm a judge because my eye has been trained by experience. So I know where I am. I have a base to see people moving in their true light.
Is this an argument against novelists traveling?
Not at all. No, I'm all for that too, because then you write from a different point of view, that of the outsider who sees things afresh. I mean, I do. I'm not speaking for anyone but myself.
So it isn't anything distinctive about the South that particularly endows your work. It's rather your familiarity with the region. It could as well be the Middle West.
It endows me, and
Why?
It enables me because place does endow. I feel that I learn through my roots and understand better what I have lived with and come to know, and those are the tools you write with. And
well, I can understand that, but people, you know, don't much talk about the literary tradition of the Rockies or the Pacific Northwest. And I mean, quite apart from the fact that historically the South is an old part of this continent, what is it in the South that grabs people and causes them to want to write about it?
Well, I don't know. I think this probably has been said 1,000 times because all sorts of things have been said.
Well, it could be true even if it was said 1,000 times.
But I think the Southerner is a talker by nature, but not only a talker, we're used to an audience, we're used to a listener. And that does something to our narrative style, I think. I think you could talk in the Rocky Mountains, you wouldn't get anything back but an echo.
Well, does that mean that because you're talkers by nature, you develop the art?
Yeah, we like to entertain and please, and we also rejoice in response. And I think that helps the narrative style.
Whereas, say, in New England, people would be primarily taciturn.
I don't know. That's what people say they are. I haven't noticed.
I wish they were more taciturn in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Well, the art of communication, therefore, gets practiced in the South, does it? Because people
From
spend...
the cradle.
Uh-huh. Well, now, does television affect that, as far as you can see?
I don't know. It probably does.
Make people more passive in their social relations?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that there are many other things to entertain us now, but in the early days of the South, people didn't have anything else to entertain themselves with except each other. That was in the days of the porch sitting and the Faulkner stories. Don't you agree?
Yeah. To me, the advantage is what you say, coming from a region which has a tradition, but also from this tradition, I think you have a perspective on the United States culture, which probably you would not have if you were born and raised in New York or Chicago. So I think one of the advantages of being a Southern writer is the advantage of a perspective, so that you are in a subculture in one sense, and in another sense you're able to look at the main culture from outside. And maybe it's possible to see the forest better from the outside than from the inside.
Well, is the difficulty we're trying to finger here with some writers outside the South in particular, that of deracination? Is this what you mean by saying talking from the inside, the idea of roots struck and productive?
Right. I don't think that you could recognize deracination unless you had some tradition or some fixed point from which to see it. Mm-hmm. Reminds me of a remark of Flannery O'Connor when somebody asked her, a New York critic asked her, why she had so many freaks in her novels, and she said, well, in the South we still recognize freaks, you see. As freaks. As freaks.
Yeah. Those are freaks are normal, then there cease to be freaks. Huh? Well, the fact that one develops roots in the South seems to me to escape answering the question, why doesn't one develop roots elsewhere that are as productive? Is there an obvious answer to that? Well, probably there isn't an obvious answer. Is there an unobvious answer to that?
Well, I think the obvious answer is that the difference in the two cultures is, well, incidentally, that the two cultures are merging now, and there's less and less difference. I mean, Jackson is more and more like Cincinnati and more and more like Atlanta. But I think that perhaps it's still possible to characterize the South as having a tradition which is more oriented toward history, toward the family, as Eudora said, toward storytelling, and toward tragedy. I mean, we got beat. Yeah. And whereas the North...
Was that a tragedy?
Well, that's a big question. We can take that up. But the North early on became a technological society, and with less interested in roots and tradition. So I like to think of it as a kind of a chemical reaction. What happened is you had these two cultures which were far apart in the beginning. They was too far apart, so far apart that there was not much interaction. So that I think for 100 years, Southern literature before and after the Civil War was not particularly distinguished. It was ingrown. It was either romantic or it was defensive. They were trying to defend slavery as an institution, and later trying to defend segregation. And then along about 1920, I think the cultures began to merge, and you had a kind of a spark jumping, so that you had people like Faulkner coming on, who began to write about their region, but in such universal terms, neither romantically or defensively, that it made itself understood to people from other parts of the country. And then I think that this so-called Southern Renaissance probably lasted maybe 20 or 30 years, and now I think the two cultures have merged so that the South is more or less like the rest of the country. And I don't really think that there are probably any more Southern writers now than they are, say, in Chicago or I mean, young writers coming on.
Well, yeah, I never meant the observation so much to be numerical as qualitative. Is it your guess that the quality of Southern literary art is going to cease to be distinctive?
I'm not aware that the younger Southern writers are any better than young writers coming from anywhere else. I don't know whether Eudora would agree with that or not.
Would you, Miss Welty?
I'm not sure I've seen enough, but I would agree so far as I know, because I think their eye is no longer self-conscious. I mean, the art of writing as a Southerner would now be a self-conscious thing to do, I think. It never used to be. When we were coming along, we just wrote because this is where we lived and what we knew. But to write strictly a Southern book now, I think you're quite conscious of that you're seeing a segment and that people are going to look at it.
If there's any Spanish morse there at all.
I don't know.
When you talk about the response of the South, how do you handle the generality, or is there a generality, maybe we'll become one now, that Southern writers are usually discovered by the North?
Well, that's where the editors live. Is that what you mean?
Well, also the book buyers.
Yeah, well, to speak for myself,
do your books sell well in the South compared to other parts of the country?
Oh, they don't sell well anyway. But, I mean, I'm not much of a seller. But actually, though, it was the Southerners who were first good to me and first published my work, the Southern Review in Baton Rouge. It took me 6 years to sell a story to a magazine of national circulation. But from the start, the Southern Review
was most hospitable.
So I feel that I was discovered in the South.
Yeah. But in terms of this response, it's, I understand what you mean by saying that the social contact between people in the South is more vivid than in the North, but I have not in my own experience seen that this transfers automatically on through the disembodied intermediary of a book.
Well, I can tell you something that I think would apply. That is, if you grew up in the South, when things were relatively stable, when there was a lot of talk and so on, you get a great sense of a person's whole life because you know all of the families, you know several generations because they all live together. You know what happened to so-and-so clear through their lives. You get a narrative sense of your next door neighbor instead of someone you just meet in the supermarket, which you do today, or you just see people in flashes. You had a sense of what happened to them and probably why, because look what happened to her grandmother.
Oh, I see.
And you watch life and it's happening. Well, that's a novel. I don't mean you would take somebody's life and make a novel, but your turn of mind would be a dramatic one.
Well, the dramatic turn of mind, of course, makes for readable prose, but it doesn't necessarily, or does it, make for prose that gets read by a society that doesn't read.
No, I was really talking about subject matter, I guess, instead of...
appealing subject matter.
Yeah. I don't know, that's so individual. I don't see how you could ever make I feel like Walker, it doesn't matter where you were born in that respect.
Well, pressing the point just a little bit, it is, as you know, widely believed in the South that the South, I mean the North rather, the South is a Philistia with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 oases, of which a solid minority are sitting here with me right now, and that you sort of reel drunkenly from a Greenville and have to go about 500 miles before you find somebody else who is literate. This is, of course, caricature, but they like to buttress it with figures, book sales, for instance, what's the truth there?
Well, it may be partly economic. You know, Faulkner used to say that he could sell more, he sold more novels in Japan than he did in Mississippi. And
Well, Japan's a lot bigger.
And that's true. But the point is that it's true. Maybe fewer people buy books in the South than they do in New York. But at $8.95 a copy, you know, few people can afford it in the South than in New York.
Well, you're talking pre-paperback.
Yeah, and
I'm talking post-paperback.
I'm talking about those hardcovers where you make your money.
Yeah.
And what happens at home, for instance, I'll see somebody on the street and they'll say, look, don't worry, I'm going to read your book. I got my name on the library list, so it's coming up, you see.
Well, are you suggesting, therefore, that the libraries circulate much more here than they do in the North? That most of the reading here is done through library copies or
it's certainly done considerably here. I don't know how much is done in the North. Public library in a small southern town is heavily used. I know that.
Well, is there a sort of a validating correlation between the increase of wealth in the South and the increase in reading?
I think so. I think more books are bought, particularly in places like Atlanta, Jackson, New Orleans, where there's more industry and more income. But,
more bookstores.
More bookstores. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask this: the sensibilities of the Southern writer. Well, I guess the sensibilities of any writer are always one of the things he has primarily to offer, and the sensibilities in the South must inevitably, in the past couple of generations, 2-3 generations, been deeply affected by what was then a distinctive problem here, which was the race problem. What one wonders, and what a lot of people have asked themselves, is how, in the atmosphere, let's say, of the First World War or of the 20s, could a sensitive Southern writer have lived here? Why, in the same way that people are saying, why don't people leave South Africa? How is it possible to live in South Africa? He wrote a very angry article for Harper's, 1965, which was unfriendly to the then state of Mississippi. And it was so unfriendly to the state of Mississippi that one wondered, you know, is there a law that requires Dr. Percy to stay here? I don't have a position on this, but I'm anxious to hear you both on the subject.
Well, I think you can say two things. I think you can recognize the injustice of a situation which existed at that time and still, to a degree, exists. But from a novelist's point of view, the situation is much more. From a moral point of view, it's very simple. It's either right or wrong, and there was a lot wrong. From a novelist's point of view, human relations are much more complex than saying that the white racist is wrong and the black protester is right. I mean, Faulkner was always dealing with the complexities of human relations between white people and black people, between black people and black people, so he could create a character like Dilsey, who in my mind, one of the great characters in American literature, in spite of the fact that there was a great deal of social injustice in Mississippi at the time. I don't really see how one affects the other, you know.
Well, in the sense of continuing a front, isn't it hard to? Well, let's take a reductio ad absurdum. Let me say it explicitly so I'm not misunderstood. I'm not comparing life in Mississippi to life, say, in Germany during the 30s. But a lot of people left Germany during the 30s, not because they were themselves being persecuted, not because they were Jewish, say, but because they simply didn't want to live in a society in which they saw that kind of thing countenanced. And the question is, was there an equivalent response by especially sensitive white people during the black days of the Southern experience?
Well, I'm sure some Southern writers did leave, and I know quite a few left and moved to New England.
For that reason?
Not just for that reason. Strangely enough, many of the so-called agrarian writers, members of the agrarian movement who were defending the values of the Old South, seem to have ended up in northern universities.
Yeah.
So they certainly were not leaving in protest.
Yeah.
But I think maybe the what one does, and at least for myself, the best thing to do is to stay where you are.
Yeah.
And
I do too, because I was here all that time, and I felt the unreality of late night telephone calls from strangers asking me, how can you stay in that place? Why don't you use all of your novelistic powers and so on and write some things against this? And really, I assumed that my whole life I've been writing about injustice, and if I wanted to, and love and hate and so on. They're human characteristics, which I had certainly been able to see long before it was pointed out to me by what happened in those years. I was always against it, but what I was writing about was human beings. I put it in the form of fiction, that is, in dramatic form. I was writing about it from the inside, not from the outside, and when it was stated from the outside, it seemed to me so thin and artificial. I once did write a story. I was writing a novel at the time, and when Medgar Evers was assassinated here, that night, it just pushed up through what I was doing. And that night I thought to myself, I've lived here all my life. I know the kind of mind that did this. This was before anyone was caught. So I wrote a story in the first person as the murderer, because I thought, I'm in a position where I know what this man must feel like. I've lived with this kind of thing.
And did he sound like Beckwith when you were through?
I think so. Someone said, it was published in the New Yorker almost overnight, and in the meanwhile, Beckwith had been arrested, so we had to change everything in it that would in the least seem to incriminate his trial.
Was there a lot to change? Was there a lot to change, which would be high tribute
nothing was
to
changed that mattered. Things would change, would be like the
my
kind of automobile.
My point was that did you end up knowing his profile so clearly?
I think I had it on the inside. But if somebody said to me, no, you thought it was a Snopes and it was a Compson. But at that time, there wasn't too much difference.
Artistic license.
You know.
Yeah.
No, but I did know the inside, and I wrote that from the interior.
Right.
Because I felt that I could. That's the only time that kind of thing ever happened to me.
And that would not have been possible, let's say, writing about, Dr. Speck in Chicago.
Oh, no.
Any of those people.
No. It was, what I was writing about really was that world of hate that I felt I had grown up with, and I felt I could speak as someone who knew it.
Yeah.
And I didn't think anything else written about things like that were anything but more or less tracts.
Because hatred can be useful too, can't it?
Well, I just wrote from deep feeling and horror. You know, it was a real story.
When there was a reference in one of your pieces to the final evolution in the attitude of William Faulkner, I didn't altogether understand it. But I think you were saying that he had been latitudinarian in his attitude on the race problem and was finally catapulted out of it by some episode. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I remember, but I think what happened was that he published a notorious letter in the Reporter. To the Reporter or Commercial Appeal about the time of the Troubles in the early 60s, in which he said he felt his Mississippi rancor coming up, and he said there's going to be some shooting in the streets, and Mississippians are going to be doing the shootings, and he seemed to favor it. But I think it's fair to say in the last few years of his life, he certainly reversed his attitude on that, and was certainly on the side of civil rights.
Yeah.
Judging from repeated statements he made at the University of Virginia and also at West Point. And,
if someone undertook the challenge of tracing the evolution of his position on it in his novels, would they come up with something?
Well, that would be hard to do, because I think here again his attention as a novelist was not devoted to the issue. He was devoted to people. And you know, nothing is more difficult to write than a good protest novel. The angrier you are, the worse novel you're liable to write.
That's
Yeah,
right.
you've made that point in an essay. I know that.
Did I? Well, I believe it.
It's true, and the people who have managed to do it in spite of the fact that they are starting out to write a tract or a propaganda novel. I'm thinking of somebody like Dostoevsky, who would start out to write a tract. He'd read something that made him mad in the paper, and he would write an anti-revolutionary novel. But somehow or other, the genius of the novelist took over, and it became a great novel in spite of his strong feelings against a certain political or social issue.
Has there been a good protest novel written in the South?
I can only think of one, Richard Wright's novel, but two, Ralph Ellison's, which I think transcends. The reason it's a great novel, it transcends the protest, and the character becomes a universal figure of a modern alienation, which was a remarkable feat he pulled off, I think.
In what category would you put Styron's Nat Turner?
Well, actually, I didn't think of it as a novel. I thought of it as a historical study. Truthfully,
Great heavens, was it accurate?
Truthfully, I like it a lot less than I did his first novel, and I have ambivalent feelings about it. I'm not sure it truly represented what Nat Turner was really like.
Was that his objective?
I don't know what it was, but in spite of the good things in it and the fact that I enjoyed it, when I finished it, I couldn't help but wonder what Nat Turner was really like. Was he like this? Maybe I doubted it.
I never got the impression he was supposed to be like that. However, that well, you talk now about the merging of the cultures, and I guess it was inevitable. I guess also everybody seems to agree on what one stands to gain from it. What does one stand to lose?
Some identity, probably, but a different reaching identity. I don't know, I see the novel or literature, whatever, just as if it were an ocean, and all these various things like the novel of protest, the novel of this and that, are just like little chips floating on it. But I feel that the novel itself, which is a work of imagination, is so much more profound and so much more full of monsters and beautiful things and all sorts of just a big world in itself, that's the part that matters. That will always be there. And that all these other things just come and go and float around on it. They're important, but they're not everything.
Well, you're talking now exclusively as a novelist, and
well, that's all I am.
right. Well, no, you're more things than that. You're also a human being and an American and a Southerner. I can imagine Caruso talking about the biological evolution of the Italian race based on whether X number of bel cantos would come from it. But let's concede that there will always be something for a novelist to do. I think that in fact has been established. But what is it that, in terms of that which is socially desirable, threatens now to go or to atrophy with the... I got a stuffy letter from a doctor saying I should say atrophy. Is that right?
That was the last way I heard it.
The threatens to go as a result of the merging of these cultures.
Well, of course, what we stand to lose, not just from the point of view of the novel, but from the point of view of the culture, is a result of homogenization. One excerpt comes to look just like another one, so that an excerpt of Jackson looks exactly like an excerpt of any other city in America. But the task of the novelist is something else. I think the task of the novelist, and I would like to hope that maybe the Southerner with his peculiar tradition might contribute to this, is somehow to humanize the new American culture. maybe somehow he can bring his talents to bear on the supermarket and the shopping center and the shopping mall and treat it in ways which, say, a Connecticut or New York novice was unable to.
Well, you wrote the movie, Gar.
Yeah.
Which is
well, of course, I think that is a task of a novelist. What we're seeing the end of is the end of a traditional Southern novel where you're dealing with small towns, country people, and in a few years there won't be many left. So, for better or for worse, we're going to have to deal with the new scene. It's going to be quite a trick.
Yeah, you will obviously have to do that, and you've anticipated it in your last novel, where you deal, I hope, with a world that we'll never have to deal with as a practical matter. But in a search for the sources of the Southern imagination, one thinks of certain Southern strengths. You've named a couple of them. You name now only the loss of identity as one of those that will be dissipated by this fusion of the two cultures. What as a practical matter will this mean? Will this mean that people in their attitude towards Mississippi will exhibit less of sort of the Confederate syndrome? Will they care less to preserve the home of Jefferson Davis, or will they feel less of a sense of at-homeness when they're here? Is that what you anticipate?
I don't know. I was just thinking from the workmanship point of view of the novelist. I mean, I'm not a bit interested in preserving the home of Jefferson Davis.
Why not?
Because I'm interested in human beings that are alive, and I mean, I respect history for what it is, but I'm speaking as a worker, somebody who likes to write. I like living life. What I want to do is find out.
But you were talking about the importance of the grandmother just a few moments ago.
I know, but that's all part of it. I mean, that's.
But she's dead.
What a character is a taproot that goes clear down. It used to be it didn't have very far to go to get to maybe something that was easier to say. But now there's so many layers of life, so many blurrings, and so many homogeneous things together that you have to send the taproot down perhaps deeper.
Further and further.
But you're always going to get the same thing, because what you want is an essence, a dramatic entity, the human being to be shown as unlike any other human being, because that's what human beings are. And you've got to show them that way. The Jefferson Davis doesn't have much to do with it, is what I'm trying to say.
You know, of course, I think the bad thing that's happened with the South has been the loss of this Southern tradition in these magical 20 or 30 years, which I think are more or less gone. The best thing that's happened in the past 10 years, I think, and people don't really realize this, I don't believe, and that is that for the first time, I think, in Southern history, for the first time in 150 years, the South is no longer defensive. I mean, for the first time since the Revolutionary days, around 1820 or 30, the South is not trying to defend this peculiar institution or for what followed it. And I don't think we realize how much Southern talents and Southern brains went to defending this. I remember growing up when the best brains in the Senate and the House from the South were devoted to defending against the anti-lynch bill, devising parliamentary maneuvers to defeat the anti-lynch bill. And that's, to me, is a poor way to spend your time and energies. So now I think that the rest of the country is in so much trouble, and the South knows this, and whatever the good and bad of this, at least the guilt of the South is sufficiently assuaged. So it's no longer defensive, and I think this is going to lead to a release of Southern energies, both in the political field and I hope literary fields.
I agree, and when I said that about Jefferson Davis, what I meant was we don't have to go back to that to tell us anything. When I said I wasn't interested in Jefferson Davis, I mean we have other things. That lack of defensiveness, I guess, is what I was really meaning. We don't have to say anything except.
No, I didn't really mean that the whole of the South can be expected to focus on 19th century icons. I was using him purely as a symbol. Everybody in the South knows who Jefferson Davis was,
sure.
and this is one thing that distinguishes the South from other parts of the country.
And influence.
Now, one talks about the South as the last true American community, and a community has its myths, its history that it nourishes and cherishes, and that I take it is going to be one of the casualties. Perhaps you may say in balance worth losing, but it is a loss just the same, right? And that's why I'm wondering whether 20 years from now the South will be literally indistinguishable from the North, with the single exception that the weather will be hotter. Or maybe they'll change that too.
I don't know. That's a good question. I hope not.
I hope not, too.
You say you don't know. I bet you're working on a novel that gives all the answers, and you're husbanding the details. Let's hear from the panel, Mr. Dan Hise of the English Department of MILLSAPS College.
First, I'd like you to say a few more things about how the Southern writer can contribute to the rest of the country, help humanize our culture.
Well,
You mentioned shopping centers.
By the way, are you against shopping centers?
no, indeed. I would have to back up on that. You see, I come at literature from a different point of view from Eudora Welty. So we speak of Southern writers. We have something in common. We have a lot different. She's a woman of letters in the best sense of the word. She's practices the art of the novel and practices it. She's about the best we've got. I practice a lower or more bastard art, actually. I came at it from science. I was brought up in a scientific education. I'm not particularly well read. So what happened to me, I did a lot of some science, medical school, got interested in the scientific method. And I made what to me was a great discovery. There's nothing new. It was discovered before that by Kierkegaard. Namely that the scientific method cannot make a single statement about the individual, man, insofar as he's an individual. He can only describe a man insofar as he resembles other people. So science can say nothing whatever about the individual man. So it suddenly occurred to me, how do you go about talking about the individual man? And finally I came to realize that the novel could be approached as a very serious effort to an extension of science, if you will, a serious effort to explore the individual man, what I call the postmodern man, his predicament, his perennial predicament, his particular historical predicament, and do it in a very serious way. And so, to answer your question, my novels attempt to be an exploration of what it is to be a man living in a particular time in a particular place. And if you're talking about making him human, this is part of the exploration. I'm trying to explore what it is to be human. So what it is to live in a certain place at a certain time.
Professor Jerry Ward of the English Department of TOUGALOO College.
Yes, Mr. Buckley, perhaps this was an oversight in programming, but as we try to find what are the sources of the Southern imagination, it seems to me that we should have considered the black writers from the South.
Well, two of them
now, we did mention Ellison and we did mention Richard Wright. We said nothing about Margaret Walker Alexander, for example, or Ernest Gaines, or Alice Walker, who's from Georgia. Because it seems that if we're looking for something in the South that is new, a group of writers who have not decided that the South is really dead, and who are still trying to find something there to hang on to, something that they can develop in their writing, it would be coming from the younger black writers and some of the older ones. There is something that Miss Welty uses quite a bit in her work that a lot of the black writers have been using and are trying to develop in a new way, and that is folklore. A feeling for the people a feeling for those things that have been closest to the hearts of the people, although they might not have received any kind of academic recognition. And I'm just wondering, I would like to address this to Ms. Welty. In your own writing, do you feel that this is perhaps the one thing that marks it as Southern, a very fine feeling for the human being in a way that Northern writers or Western writers might not be capable of handling it?
I didn't understand the question. Do I feel that what?
No, and I'm trying to find out what is the source of power in your own writing. Would you say that it's folklore?
Well, I'm certainly aware of all the existing folklore that is here. I mean, I would use anything, you know, just whatever is about that I think truly expresses what I see in life around me. I have used not only Mississippi folklore, but Greek and Roman myths or anything else, Irish stories, anything else that happens to come in handy that I think is an expression of something that I see around me in the life. I don't start out just to write something and use folklore. It's just there to be plucked.
What about the larger question of Mr. Ward, namely that the black experience in the South ought itself to be the source of a tremendous amount of artistic interest?
I agree. I think it should be I have read a good many of our new young black writers and think highly of their, both their work and their capacities. And I think that's certainly a resource that is going to be very powerful in the future.
Dr. Gordon Weaver, the director of the Center for Writers at the University of Southern Mississippi.
I'd like to address this question to both Ms. Welty and Dr. Percy, and going back to something that Mr. Buckley said, in recognizing it's a spurious kind of comparison between Nazi Germany and Mississippi, but proceeding on that kind of fallacious basis. Among the people that left Germany and suffered to some extent were writers, the suppression, and I'm just curious if you ever felt, either of you, during the time of the more dramatic troubles in Mississippi or in the South, any kind of insecurity as writers. That is to say, the South was proud of you as writers and oftentimes would hold you up to the North, I assume, as symbols of their culture, but that you were safe only so long as you might have stayed away from. I don't mean to suggest that you did stay away from anything that was politically touchy or something, but did you ever feel that there was an atmosphere coming out of perhaps the political superstructure that one had best stay away from these things if one was going to stay in the South and be comfortable there? Did you ever feel the hand then of government, however far back in the shadows, as a writer?
I didn't feel any avoidance in anything I was doing, and I might get just as mad as I could be about things at home, and then I'd go up to New York, and the things that people would say there made me madder, and I would feel defensive because there was a great void of ignorance between the two parts of the country. I think a writer all his life is aware of all sorts of threatening and menacing things going on. This time was very open and dramatized and the whole world knew about it. But there's always the human threats of people, of injustice and all these other things that go on through your whole life. And you can't run away from that. I mean, that's the life of which you're writing and of which you're taking part. I can't see that you ever avoid anything as long as you're writing an honest story about human beings. You're writing about the same thing. Maybe I talk too much.
When you say that you cease to be defensive, actually it was Walker Percy who first made the point. Does it go on? Do you go on feeling some bitterness over the hypocrisy of the North
Yeah,
it having
okay.
during the period that has ushered in the so-called Southern tranquility, it has ushered in a national recognition of entrenched bigotry in other parts of the country that made a living off of moralizing at the expense of the South. Now, is this bringing on a vindictive reaction on the part of Southern intellectuals or a generous reaction?
Well, yeah, I think the point is that the North is so preoccupied with its own difficulties that the Northern moralists are no longer concerned with the South. They're too busy. They're very busy worrying with their own problems, and the old Northern habit, particularly New England habit, of using the South as an American demon and scapegoat, no longer true. So I for one feel no bitterness or no desire to redress grievances. I think that's the good thing about it is I think we both sections of the country feel much more American in face of our common problems now rather than the problems that divided us before.
Actually, I think you felt that all the time among individuals. When you're friends in the North, you know, with everything always open, and we felt the understanding was always that was the casual person at the dinner party who'd never met you before who would say something that would really make your hair stand on end. Well, I don't feel anything about that now either.
Strangely enough, even at the worst times, there was never a time when I felt that in spite of my opinions, that I should leave Mississippi or Louisiana. I mean, this may be hard to understand, but even at the worst times, I think, paradoxically, the South is known for its violence and a good bit of violence, but at the same time, there's a certain tolerance and civility toward people and their opinions. Maybe it's because the Southerners look on writers as harmless and eccentric, and you're expected to say strange things.
And do.
And do.
Mr. Hise.
I was wondering, Dr. Percy, when you named your central character in Love in the Ruins Thomas More, whether you weren't intending to present a redefinition of America, since the original Thomas More, in a sense, defined America in the first place, the utopian myth, the New Eden, and so forth.
No, that wasn't the reason. I wanted to, unlike the first two novels, I wanted to establish a Catholic point of view, and to identify the main character as a Catholic of a certain sort, not Irish, but English, which is a strange category in itself. It's a small minority. Here again, it's a question of perspective. I figured that an English descendant of an English Catholic would be in a particular advantageous position to see all around him, see his fellow Catholics, his fellow Protestants, and other people. So I wanted to establish a Catholic, from a certain Catholic point of view from the beginning.
Mr. Ward?
Yes, Mr. Percy, in an interview once you said some things about the loss of God. You didn't call it the death of God, you called it the loss of God, or the loss of man's power to believe in God. Do you see that this has been, well, a kind of result in the South of some of the problems that we've had? Do you see that the young Southern writer, perhaps, is going to turn to other things other than institutionalized religion or the old traditions as a source of sustenance?
Yeah, I think you're right. He certainly is. But if I recall the article correctly, I was defining religion in a very broad sense of saying that a writer is often addresses himself to ultimate concerns, and he's a religious writer whether he's dealing with God or the loss of God. In either case, it's a religious quest. And as Tommy once said, all issues are ultimately religious. So whether the writer is dealing with God or the loss of it, to me, it falls in the same category.
Mr. Weaver?
I'm wondering, given the tradition of fine Southern writers, is it possible that a number of writers who happened to be from the South and wrote about Southern subjects, stories located in the South, may have been overrated by the rest of the country because there were so many good ones? Have bad or mediocre writers crept in to national literary reputation on the shirt tails of writers like yourself or Faulkner or?
You asking me?
Yes, well, either or both of you, Miss Welty.
Who are we to say? I mean, I would hate to think that anybody was trying to.
I don't mean in a self-conscious plan, but just that,
No,
that maybe
I know
the
it.
rest of the
No, I don't
non-South may overvalue.
I don't know of
any
a
writer
single
from the
case
South.
myself, but I don't think so. I don't see how that could well be.
Well, there have been, for instance, novels that, and writers from the South who have very explicitly exploited, for instance, the troubles of the 60s and that kind of thing. I don't want to name names, but there are some who have written novels
You
about...
go ahead. You may if you want.
I'd rather not. But and you said before that there were these concerns with social protest struck you as being somewhat outside what you thought was the really profound and valuable things in literature. And I just wondered if maybe the North, if you would agree that the Northern critics and so on may look at all Southern writers in a lump, and it may have the effect of perhaps giving cachet of a kind to some mediocre Southern writers.
I'm not familiar with whoever it is you're talking about, I guess, but I think that...
That's because they're too choosy.
No, but I think the thing is general anyway. The whole country is full of people who are jumping on bandwagons every time they go past the corner. And every concern, but I don't think you can blame any section of the country. I mean, put the cause of it on any section of the country. Those things are either good or bad according to their own merits. And I don't feel...
Yeah, well, I think of your question in terms of people who were influenced by Faulkner, Southern writers who were influenced by Faulkner. And incidentally, I think for this reason, Faulkner has been both a blessing and a curse to the South. A blessing because he's probably the greatest American novelist of this century. A curse because he was so powerful and influential that many Southern writers, younger writers who came after him were influenced even to imitate his idiosyncrasies and his styles and his sentences. So that I think I can think of a few writers whose names I also will not mention who have published as imitation Faulkners, and
but that's a different kind of influence.
Yeah.
It's an honest kind and a benign one, even if it doesn't work out very well.
But I think it's important to get out from under the...
I do too,
the
but I mean,
big
one
man.
is a fashion and the other is a serious attempt.
Yeah.
Mr. Hise.
You never did, Dr. Percy, get to the question of the Civil War as a tragedy. Couldn't it be thought of more as a kind of fortunate fall? And C. Van Woodward's sense that the South could no longer participate in the American myths, and it's taken the rest of America 100 years to find out what the South found out at the time of the Civil War.
Well, in the last novel I wrote, the novel ended on the hope that the South would do for the country what the North did 100 years ago. The North saved the Union, which was probably a good thing. And I was hoping, in the novel, the country falls apart again. Here, in this case, it's the great northern cities who break away from the rest of the country. So, it was hoped in the novel that the reconciliation would take place in the South and extend to the black-white reconciliation, liberal-conservative would happen in the South. This was a hope, and it would certainly be a poetic justice if this would happen.
Does that answer your question, or is that evaded a little bit?
So it's not really a tragedy, you know, hopefully.
When you say that much of what happened to the South is the result of its having got beat, do you mean chastened?
No, I was thinking of the novelist's equipment and maybe a tragic sense of life being an indispensable part of this equipment. And the North, never having lost a war, didn't have it. And so if this is the case, and the South certainly had a tragic sense of life for a long time after the Civil War.
And why did that not, during the 19th century, result in interesting novels? You said because it was over-defensive?
I think it was defensive. It was either romantic or defensive. And there was too much hurt and too much anger, and I think it took a while to be digested. And I think that it happened along about 1920 or 30.
Would you say that, that Japan and Germany will need themselves also to pass a couple of generations before they can write interestingly, their writers?
Well, they got help from the United States in their Reconstruction.
Yeah.
You distinguish that between that and what the North did.
Yeah.
And your point was that sapped the bitterness. But what about the defensiveness?
You mean in Germany and Japan?
In the American South, there was a lot of antebellum enthusiasm, but there isn't in Germany very much enthusiasm for their experience.
History seems to be accelerating. Things happen so much faster than they used to. World War II seems to have been forgotten by the Japanese and the Germans, and maybe it's because they don't like to think about it. But and as I say, the material effects.
But the old order was all that the South had left, wasn't it?
For a long time.
And under the circumstances, mooched on it in every sense of it. In some commendable.
I would like to think that the Southern literature in the 19th century was good, was first class, but I don't think it was. I can only think of one or two writers who compared with the New England writers.
Thank you, Dr. Percy. Thank you, Miss Welty, and gentlemen of the panel, ladies and gentlemen.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is a presentation of the Southern Educational Communications Association.